Hey, welcome back to Automatic CSS 101. In this video, you are going to learn about the power and the magic of auto grids, which are automatically responsive grids, layouts where you don't have to manage breakpoints to determine when the grids stack. This is a completely refactored feature in version 3.0, and it is now more powerful than ever. So let's go ahead and take a look. First of all, what is auto grid? How do you turn it on? How is it different from traditional grids? Let's take a look at that. First things first is using auto grid, you need to have it on. So we're going to go to the dashboard. We're going to go to options, utility classes, and we're going to find auto grid right here. Okay, once that is on in the layout tab, you're going to have a new dropdown called auto grid. And under that, you are going to have some control points. One of them is called aggressiveness. One of them is called ratio breakpoint. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But if you're following along with this, you're going to want to make sure auto grid is on and you are ready to go. So what we're going to do to demonstrate auto grid is I'm going to add a container into this section here, and I'm going to add two blocks. What we're going to do is put a content block next to an image block. So in this content block, we're going to say, I want heading, I want text, and I want a button. And over here, I'm going to say, I want an image, and I'm going to choose an image really quick, Nike logo. Okay, so I want this content to live side by side. You already know, based on the last video where we talked about traditional grids, that you can right-click the context, the classes area and get to the context menu, type in grid, and here are all of your traditional grids right here. Now, what is the difference between a traditional grid and an auto grid? Remember, a traditional grid, if you choose grid 2, you're then going to have to check the breakpoints and see, all right, when do I want this to be a one-column grid? And then you're going to have to add another utility class that tells the page, hey, at this breakpoint, you need to stack and become one column instead of two. So it requires breakpoint management. You have to look through the breakpoints. You have to make a decision. You have to add another utility class. But with auto grids, none of this has to happen. With auto grids, which are found down here in the auto grids area, I simply choose grid auto 2. It's going to put that content side by side. Let's go ahead and jump to the front end and just start inspecting the page. And let's take a look as I compress this screen, what happens, okay? So we're going to come in. It's obviously compressing. And right there, you see it goes to one column. It does that on its own. I don't have to look at any breakpoints. I don't have to make any decisions. This is the default behavior of auto grid, which is really, really, really fantastic, okay? Now, some people might ask the question. Let's go down. And it says, how can we control when items decide to stack? Do we have any control over that? Well, in Automatic CSS, you do. This is the only framework that gives you a control point like this over all of your auto grids, and we call it aggressiveness. How aggressive is the stacking context of the auto grid? If it allows much, much, much more compression or less compression before it stacks, this is what we refer to as aggressiveness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a container, and I'm just going to drop 4 images in here. Okay, so we're just going to say image. Really easy to demonstrate this kind of stuff with images. We don't have to worry about cards or building much of anything. So that's 1 image, 2, 3, 4. I'm just doing some duplicating, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to grab that container. I'm going to go grid auto 4. All right, perfect. So now let's go ahead and jump back to the front end. Question first is, do we have a responsive grid? Well, it's an auto grid, so it should be automatically responsive. And let's see. Okay. Did I do grid 4 or did I do grid auto? See, I did grid 4. I didn't do grid auto 4. That's the difference, right? It was not automatically responsive. I'm going to choose grid auto 4. Okay, let's hop back. Let's refresh on the front end. Check this out. So it goes to 3, it goes to 2, and it goes down to 1. So we have a 4-column grid now that is automatically responsive. But again, we need to answer the question, how can we control when the items decide to stack? Well, let's take a look at this. Open the dashboard, layout, auto grid, and we have an aggressiveness value of 0.7 by default, which is a very just middle value, like should work on most websites. But there could be times where you're like, I don't want them to stack so soon. Like, I want more compression. Or you might think the opposite. You might think, it's compressing my content a little too much for my taste. I actually want auto grids to stack sooner. Well, if you want them to stack sooner, let's go to something like 0.9. The higher the number is, and you can go anywhere from 0.1 to 1. Okay, so higher the number, 0.9, things are going to stack sooner, right? Lower number is going to allow much more compression. So we're going to visualize this. Right now we are at 0.9. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. And let's start to take a look at how these grids stack. So I'm going to bring this in, and as it starts to compress, look at that. It's already started stacking. Let's go check this one. Look, it's already started stacking this grid. It's going to allow some compression, but it is going to stack sooner, okay? We're going to come in, and finally, where are we at when it gets to one column? We're at 665 pixels when it finally gets to one column. So now let's do the opposite. Let's look at what it looks like to allow much more compression. So layout auto grid, we're going to do something like 0.4. I'm going to go ahead and save, and then we will hide the dashboard. And then I'll just refresh the page to make sure that we're good to go. Let's take a look now at how this is behaving. So here's our little hero section. Look at how much compression it's allowing. Look at how much compression it's allowing. Then it finally stacks. Okay? That's what 0.4 looks like. Very different from 0.7. Obviously very, very different from what was happening at 0.9. Let's go check in here. Look, it's just now at 617 getting down to 3 columns. We come in, still 3 columns. Now it's 2 columns at 469. And then we come down, and when does it finally get to 1 column at 314? Huge difference from where we were at 0.9 and 0.7. And the good news is, this is completely up to you. You get to dial this control in. But it does beg yet another question. Pixel perfect auto grid. But Kevin, what if we want perfect control? Like pixel perfect control. Is that even possible? Well, yes, it is. Automatic CSS, again, the only framework that gives you an aggressiveness control over all of your auto grids. But guess what? You also get pixel perfect control over each individual auto grid. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Why don't we just duplicate this grid right here, and let's bring it down below this one. So it's now in this section where we're talking about pixel perfect auto grid. We still have the same grid auto 4. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's measure this element right here. Let's just see, what are we at width-wise? Let's not be in there. Let's just grab this element right here. Okay, you can see right there, it is 319 pixels wide. Now, I want to make one decision, okay? My one decision is going to be, when do I want this grid to stack? And it's based on the size of the items. So I'm going to decide, all right, that item looks good down to what value, right? So we're going to start compressing this. And I'm going to say maybe right here, it's starting to get a little too small for me. Now look, the normal aggressiveness has not caused this grid to stack yet. But based visually on the content that I'm seeing inside this particular grid, I'm just coming to the conclusion, you know what? I don't want it to get smaller than that, okay? So let's go ahead and measure it. It's 239.57 pixels. Let's say 240 is our cutoff. 240, we don't want these elements ever getting smaller than 240, okay? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go back in and we're gonna look at a trick that AutoGrid has up its sleeve. It's a little bit of a hidden trick, and I'm revealing it to you right now. It is a locally scoped variable called min, which is essentially setting a minimum width for the items in the grid, saying, hey, Mr. AutoGrid, do not let elements in this grid get below this number. You need to stack when it hits this number. That's essentially what we're doing. So we have pixel perfect control over our auto grids. I'm going to go to style. I'm doing this at the ID level because I only wanted to affect this one grid, right? I'm going to do root. I'm going to come in and I am going to say min, double dash, because it's a variable. That's how you redefine variable values, double dash min. And I'm going to say 240 pixels. So remember, Pixel perfect control. Let's go ahead and hit save. Let's go to the front end. And look at this. This grid, which is the default auto grid for 4 columns, is not stacking yet. But our pixel perfect auto grid is already stacking. Why is it already stacking? Well, let's get a little bit bigger and let's measure this. Okay, let's hover over. It's 241 right now, which means if it gets a pixel smaller, it has to start stacking. Okay, so let's bring this in and it starts stacking. Pixel perfect control, where the other one has not, this one is, and it's going to do it again. Okay, so let's inspect now. Okay, hover over 253. We're getting kind of close. Ooh, okay, let's go back out. What's it at? 242.8. And as I bring it in, what's it at? 3. It's bigger now, right? Because it got more space. Look at this, 240.13. It's 0.13 pixels away from stacking. This is what I'm talking about when I say pixel perfect control over your auto grids. And this is fantastic because, guys, think about traditional grids where you're choosing a breakpoint. You're saying, okay, at the end breakpoint, I want to start stacking. Well, things might get too compressed before it actually gets there and starts stacking, or not compressed enough, right? It's not, you're making decisions about arbitrary screen sizes and breakpoints, where this level of control is actually looking at the elements in the grid, and you're making a decision based on how you want those elements to look and behave. We're not worried about arbitrary breakpoints and screen sizes. We're worried about what the compression is doing to my specific elements in this particular grid. This is unprecedented control. It's far more accurate responsiveness than the traditional grid approach. The one downside over traditional grids is this, because I do want to talk about cons, right? There's no be all end all for every situation. Every solution has different pros and cons. So check this out. What is the one big con of auto grids? And there's only a con in certain scenarios. It's 4 columns right now. When it stacks, it's going to go to 3. Some people would say, oh, no, I never wanted to go to 3. I wanted to go from 4 straight to 2, and then from 2 to 1, okay? Or they might say, I wanted to go from 4 to 2 and never to 1. Now, with auto grids, you can actually make it never go to 1. That we might cover that in a more advanced video. It is possible, okay? But what you can't do is you can't really say, I want it to go from 4 straight to 2. It's always going to go from 4 to 3 to 2, then to 1, right? If you're at 6, it's going to go 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's never going to go, you can't say go from 6 to 4, then from 4 to 2. If that's the level of control you want over that grid, then you need to go traditional grids and you need to choose it based on breakpoints, okay? Auto grid is not for you in that situation. If, however, you don't care about that, auto grid is a fantastic solution. So it's about choosing the tool for the job, right? Some instances require auto grid. Auto grid is better. In some instances, traditional grid is better. And some instances, variable grid is better, okay? Which we're gonna cover that in a separate video. Automatic CSS gives you a toolbox. It is your job to understand how your tools work and choose the best tool for the particular job that is in front of you. All right, so we talked about pixel perfect auto grid. What about gap? What do we need to know about gap? Well, I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this. And I am going to bring this down to this section right here. And what we're going to do is remove our min value. We're going to go back to our defaults, okay? Now, the one thing you need to know is that we use a grid gap value. There's a lot of math in auto grids, a lot of math, okay? And the math relies on knowing certain values. And the gap value is one of the values it needs to know because it's calculating free space, of what space is available. Well, in order to know available space, it has to know how much gap there is and how many gaps there are, right? Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna come in and I'm gonna show you how to change the gap. Here's the first way. You can absolutely come up here and type in gap and use one of our gap utility classes, okay? And so if I do something like extreme, like gap XXL, it doesn't break the grid. The grid is fine. The grid still calculating perfectly fine. You can do that, no problem whatsoever. So you can use a gap class. You can redefine the value of grid gap to anything that you want. Here's how you would do that. So you would come down here and you would say root, and you would do double dash grid gap, and then I can do something like space XXL. Okay, and now I get space XXL, and look, the grid does not break. All is fine in the world. So that's another way that I can manage the gap in my auto grids. What I can't do is just come in with some arbitrary value, because it doesn't know the gap is no longer, or the grid is no longer informed of what that gap value actually is. Even if you used a spacing variable like space XXL, it's not tied to the grid gap variable, right? So the grid doesn't know. It's not informed of the fact that you are taking up way more space than is currently there. All right. So the only way to set gaps properly with your auto grids without breaking them is to use the gap utility classes, which again are fine, right? And let's take that off and see if okay, Bricks is awake again. Bricks is awake again. Is to use a gap utility class or to redefine the value of grid gap. Okay, space XXL. When you redefine the value of grid gap, you're good to go, okay? Because you're still using grid gap, and that is the token that auto grids are monitoring and looking for in order to do their recalculation, okay? So that's one big thing you need to know about auto grids. Now, what about this question? Auto grid with custom classes. Do I have to use the utility classes for auto grid, or can I use custom classes? You can actually use custom classes two different ways, okay? And we'll talk about the pros and the cons. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna grab this grid. I hate when Bricks does this with the custom CSS, okay? I'm gonna paste this down here. And did I just grab the image? Oh, it looks like I just grabbed the image. Let me grab the actual grid, okay? So we're going to talk about the variable method first. So I'm going to remove grid auto 4. So the utility class is gone. I'm going to set this to display grid. And we could do this. How about we're talking about attaching this to classes. So let's use the class and let's say my custom auto grid with variable, okay? My custom auto grid with variable, okay? Terrible class name. But let's set that to display grid, and then I'm gonna come down here to grid template columns, and I'm gonna say auto, look at there's variables here. Let's do auto 4, okay? So I get a grid auto 4, and let's make my grid gap the grid gap, okay? So let's go ahead and hit save. First question is, do we have an auto responsive grid? Okay, so let's go back to the front end. Here's auto grid with custom classes, the variable method. And we're going to see it's squishing. Oh, you know what? Our aggressiveness value is still set very low. So let's go to layout, auto grid. Look at that, 0.4. No. We don't want that much compression. Okay. So let's reset that back to the default. Let's close our panel and let's see what our grids with custom classes do. Okay. Let's come down and we have our auto grid with custom classes using the variable method. Okay, let's go back. And it's hard because the page is jumping around. So let's bring it in. There it goes. It stacks to 3. Here's the one we're concerned about. And it's going to stack to 2 right there. And it's going to stack to 1. Page, man, the page jumping. Okay, let's bring this in more. There we go. Now it stacks to 1. So we're using a variable. Man, I'm hitting all sorts of different keys. We're using a variable to do this. Now, what is the downside to the variable approach? Well, the variable approach uses the default aggressiveness value, and that cannot be changed. You cannot do the min override. So you don't get the pixel perfect nature of auto grids when you go with the variable approach. If you don't need the pixel perfect nature of auto grid, then you're good to go. Just use the variable. You're good to go. But if you do need the pixel perfect approach, we're going to come down here and we're going to paste this in and we're going to talk about the second method for using custom classes with auto grids. And so this time I'm going to take off this class and I'm going to say my pixel perfect auto grid. Okay. And we're going to use what is called a recipe in automatic CSS. So we're going to go to Style, Custom CSS, and we're going to hit the symbol, and we're going to say auto grid. And then as soon as I hit a semicolon, the recipe is going to expand. Okay. And it's going to give me a 3-column auto grid by default, which if we weren't squishing the page, okay, we would see 3 columns. Now I want 4, right? So what do? Well, there's a column count right here, and we're going to change that to 4. That's going to give us 4 columns. We can go on the front end and verify this. So we're going to scroll to our auto grid with custom class recipe method. So here was the variable method. Here's the recipe method. Both are 4 columns, but the difference now, see this min value sitting right here? Now I can say 240 pixels is my min. Let's go ahead and hit save. I now have control. I have that pixel perfect control back, but I'm using custom classes. So now let's go ahead and see what the difference is. So look, the variable method, which just uses the default aggressiveness, has not stacked yet. The auto grid with recipe method, that has already started stacking because it's now looking at the minimum item width here, and they were already getting to 240, so it decided to start stacking them. So I am back to my full-blown auto grid control, but assigned to a custom class, which is extremely powerful for scalability and maintainability, as we have always talked about. Okay, let's go ahead and see one last thing. People have a question. What about staggered auto grids? Can I do 2, 3, 1, 3, all that? Surely not. Yes. Okay. In automatic CSS, the answer is yes. The answer is almost always yes in automatic CSS. Okay. So I am going to take an image. Let's get out of this panel so the screen stops jumping around bricks. Okay. So let's copy that. Let's paste, and let's paste again. So we have 2 images, and let's do a staggered auto grid. So I'm going to go to auto, and I'm going to come down here and say 1, 2. And you see I have an uneven auto grid. Let's go look at this behavior on the front end. Okay. And you're going to see that this stacks. Okay. Page is jumping a lot. There we go, because everything is stacking. So now staggered auto grids, here we are. The content decided to stack and become 1 column. Now, this is a little bit fake. The calculation is not done the same way the other auto grid calculations are done. And so this is actually done at a breakpoint, okay? And what we need to know, this is where that other control comes in, auto grid, what is the breakpoint for staggered grids, right? And so we get to choose our breakpoint. If we want more compression, we can say im. And at the im breakpoint, that's when it's going to go to 1 column. L would go to 1 column at the L breakpoint, because staggered grids are always 2 columns. It's just an uneven ratio, right? Small column, or large column, small column. And then we determine what breakpoint those staggered grids actually stack at. So you do have some staggered auto grids. They will stack automatically. You have global breakpoint control over where that is. Just wanted to explain that to you as yet another option. Okay. Common issues, just so you can understand how these work and what breaks them and what doesn't break them and things like this. Okay, common issue number 1 that I've seen, if your editor canvas size is too small, then you're going to see the wrong number of columns. And people they don't understand why this is happening. But what I'm going to do to visualize this, we're going to go up here to my monitor, and I'm going to choose a really small, like laptop size. Okay. So we'll choose something like, let's just see what 1500 does. Maybe that gets us into a situation. Okay. Let's resize our browser. And it does. I mean, look how much space is being taken up because of my screen resolution. So when I come down here, you're going to see right here, this is a grid auto 4, right? But I only see 3 columns. Why do I only see 3 columns? Well, because there's not enough space to have the 4 columns you asked for. You're at 992 with your canvas size because you got this big structure panel, you got this big thing over here, you got a browser sidebar going on. You just have to be wary of the available space, right? Because it's an auto grid. If there's not enough space, it's going to start stacking. That should make sense to people, but still they forget, oh, I'm on a smaller screen, or there's less space on my canvas, or my browser window is too small. And so you're going to see the stacking behavior in the builder. You're previewing what's happening with the auto grid because you don't have enough space. So let me go back. We're going to go to here. Okay, this is my normal editor. All right, perfect. And so I'm back now to a normal canvas size, and Grid Auto 4, I see 4 columns. Now, common issue 2. Can you change the width of an auto grid container? Yeah, absolutely. But if it gets too small, it's going to start compressing the items. It's going to start stacking the items. So here I have Grid Auto 6, but I've put a width L on here. If I took the width class off, I'd see all 6 columns. Now, the minute I say, but I want an L width container, or I want a smaller container, well, you've compressed the items too much, okay? Now remember, what you could do in this scenario is you could come stick your own min value in here and completely control the stacking behavior. So let's say min 100 pixels, right? Let's save. Look what I have now. I have 6 columns, okay? And let's get out of here and let's go down to different breakpoints. Okay, look, I still have 6 columns. Let's come down here. Now I have 5 columns because finally the items were getting to be less than 100 pixels. That custom min value, that trick up my sleeve with auto grids, I was able to get the desired effect. But out of the box, the default min was already causing the items to stack at that smaller width. I was able to override it because I have the controls. Automatic CSS gives me the controls, but I need to understand what is happening and why what I'm seeing is different from what I asked for, right? What is common issue number 3? We already talked about it. If you go rogue with your gap value and you use a gap like 32 pixels or just some random variable like space XXL, the auto grid is no longer informed of the gap value and therefore it can't do the math properly. You have to use grid gap, okay? Grid gap, and then redefine the value of grid gap. Like, I'm not gonna rehash it, but we already talked about it. Or just simply use one of our gap classes because the gap classes work out of the box. They give you the gap you want and they don't break your auto grid, okay? All right, let me go back to camera. It's actually kind of a lot to explain. I'm trying to simplify it for you as much as possible because what's going on behind the scenes, under the hood, is very complex, But what you get out of the box with a few utility classes and the trick up our sleeve, the min value, is insane power and control and workflow efficiency. You're not having to manage breakpoints all the time. You're not having to use a bunch of string of utility classes to say 6 columns, then 4 columns, then 2 columns, then 1 column. You don't have to worry about any of that. AutoGrid takes so much off of your plate and gives you tremendous control. The most accurate responsiveness available over something like traditional grids because of the min value that we can use. It's great. It's great. But you have to know how they work and you have to know how they behave and you have to know what might break them so that you can get the most out of them. Hopefully this helped. If you have any questions, drop them below in the comments or come into the support community. We are more than happy to help you as always. I'll be back with another video. We need to talk about variable grid next. Very similar to auto grid, but slightly different. All right, I'll see you soon.